Hello and welcome to the second episode of the Architect's Purpose podcast. This episode is all about the world's first architect, Filippo Brunelleschi. He emerges at the birth of the Renaissance, where he builds his famous dome at the Duomo in Florence. It is absolutely an outstanding story, and the book is called Brunelleschi's Dome by Ross King. This discussion had a few technical difficulties. Without further ado, enjoy.
Today is all about the very first architect ever. That is that's pretty much ag- agreed upon. It seems, especially because all of the building and construction that happened before the 1400s, it just took so dang long to build it that it'd be generations of builders versus one real master architect, which means master builder anyway.
But it was the idea
So
that you're building for God, so you needed to be anonymous and not necessarily bring glory to yourself.
that as well, with really the age of enlightenment in full swing, or really creeping up in the early 1400s. And so what were some of the questions that you asked your class?
So, I asked them questions about the machines that Brunelleschi developed. I asked them. So we talked a lot about the rivalry between Ghiberti and Brunelleschi,
Yeah.
and so Brunelleschi had at an early age, achieved this um, within the goldsmith. Uh, or I want to say union, but it's not. What was the union? It was the can't remember
The
the
guild, right?
guild. Yeah, the goldsmith
Yeah,
guild. That he achieved a master status at a pretty early age, and Ghiberti was a young comer upper. Um, and so, one of the issues that came up there, of course, it was the issue between, or the conflict and the competition between Keating and Roark. And, was one following one path and one following another path. Brunelleschi was trying to fend off this young upstart. He lost the competition for the doors.
well, kind of. So,
Not kind of. He did. He lost the competition to the doors, and it took Ghiberti 20
oh,
to build the doors for San Giovanni.
exactly, and way more expensive. But I'm pretty sure I remember in the book, it was an interesting point that stuck out to me, that they were actually both offered to work on the doors together. And Brunelleschi turned them down, saying, "No, I'm good. I will never work with him," and paid a gigantic scene. And that to me was the first moment in the story that it was very much like Roark, and that no, I'm not going to design with Keating because he'll just change it. And it's, I mean the parallels in this story couldn't be even more spot on, because Ghiberti was such that people pleaser and would make revision after revision just depending on whatever any passerby said, let alone a king or someone.
Right. He went out and sought people's opinions about things like Keating did. So it was really nice to have the first two chapters of the Fountainhead as a backdrop to this discussion. And so, in the same way that Keating would seek other people's approval, Ghiberti was, you know, in my opinion, a genius in his own right. And
Of course.
you and I have stood in front of the bronze doors that he created in just worshipped in awe of the beauty, the the three dimensionality of the quality of the work was just
Yeah.
amazing. So yeah, I mean, taking 20 years to do that, shit. I mean, do it. But you're right. The fact that Ghiberti sought everybody's opinion, not necessarily their approval, but their opinion to create what he thought was the right approach, and then you had Brunelleschi saying, "I got this. I'm going to do it on my own," and that was tantamount to his entire career. Um, you know, burning his notes. The fact that um, he wanted to be seen as the ultimate genius, and not necessarily because somebody offered this opinion or that opinion. So you could look at Ghiberti as, the first design studio, right?
Yeah. Ex- so a thought I just had based off of that is that I've kind of always more railed against the idea of seeking others' opinions in the extreme form. But if you do it in a more balanced and tempered way to at least get more iterations out there into the world, then you can potentially even make a more informed decision. The issue is kind of like the Jerry Jones syndrome of whoever's the last person to speak to him, that's the opinion he'll go with. And then that's like too wishy-washy versus it truly being something of rigorous study and and context as well.
So, and this will play into the next discussion that we have, but the idea of the architectural critic, we spent a lot of time talking about this in our discussion of the Odd Couple, between Johnson and Frank Lloyd Wright, that Johnson was really a critic, and that he, in creating this entire industry of architectural criticism,
Mm-hmm.
for people who, well, Johnson ultimately became an architect, but most of the architectural critics have never been architects. In many cases, aren't educated as architects,
Yeah.
and so seeking their opinion or their approval, or having them comment on your work, just in one sense. And I told my students, last night, it was like, it, pisses me off because it's so, and, I've just discussed this, it's so hard to get a building built. It's an onslaught from day one, from the design all the way through the construction. And, to seek other people's opinions about this or that, uh, is is tantamount to disaster. So the fact that Ghiberti opened himself up to this criticism, and Brunelleschi shunned all of that, created this really nice contrast between the two characters.
Mm-hmm.
So, and part of it, I think Brunelleschi already had in his head how he was going to build the dome,
Yeah.
and that the doors, the doors of San Giovanni was just a prelude to this competition that he was going to face really for the rest of his life. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
and so, again, we talked a lot about that as a group. You know, what benefit is it, to have, people that you're competing with, they push you, they drive you. I mean, I think that the fact that Ghiberti came so close to, well, first of all, he won the first
Mm-hmm.
competition in essence, or at least he tied. And,
Yeah.
um, when it came to the next competition, he let's see, Brunelleschi spent what 90 days building his full scale model or his half scale model that you could actually walk into, and
Yeah.
Ghiberti spent what 3 days or 4 days or 5 days, building his model to show to the what was the group? It was I want to say it wasn't the council, but it was
Yeah, what they call them.
I don't remember, but
Yeah.
the uh,
She was in my notes at all.
yeah, it was
The commission. No. It's not the commission, but
yeah, essentially the commission. So,
yeah,
Brunelleschi spent all this time building his model with master masons, and Ghiberti spent 3 or 4 days doing the same thing. Obviously, um, Ghiberti, I mean, Brunelleschi had a much clearer idea of what he wanted to do and how he wanted to do it, and he prevailed. And so, yes, he lost the first competition, but prevailed in what I think he really wanted to do was the dome anyway.
exactly.
And and so again, it was setting up the contrast between Keating and Roark, um, and the idea of the ultimate genius, versus seeking other people's opinions. That kind of it clearly had an ongoing effect in our discussions in class.
Spot on, and it's really quite incredible the parallels between the two uh, books, as in between Keating and Roark and um Lorenzo and Filippo, and even down to the short-term rewards versus long-term, as in both Keating and Ghiberti both have very, very early success in that they're so busy they're actually very late for a lot of their projects, but because of that austere and that popularity, they are pretty highly sought after, where Roark and Brunelleschi have to both kind of bootstrap it. I mean, at a certain point, Brunelleschi's, I believe they threaten a strike because he pays them so little, and it kind of had to do with what he was earning. But the book also describes at a certain point he was earning a pretty penny for doing his services, and also in the long term, we really remember Brunelleschi more because the Duomo is such a more magnificent achievement, even though the tours are absolutely incredible, but especially
Yeah, but
towards the end.
from the Wool Guild, he was receiving 100 florins a year,
Mm-hmm.
but Ghiberti was receiving 200 florins a year from a competing guild, and so he was getting paid twice as much doing his own thing about the doors. Where Brunelleschi, now they were both being paid by, I'm going to call the opera because I can't remember the consortium of the, the the overseers for the dome, but Ghiberti was receiving a sum of 30 florins a year, and
Mm-hmm.
Brunelleschi was receiving 100 florins a year, and eventually it dropped off for Ghiberti. But the fact that he demonstrated that Brunelleschi demonstrated this incredibly inventive way of building a dome without the scaffolding was
Mm-hmm.
you know obviously revolutionary.
Yeah.
And I mean, the machinery of even being able to he was 200 years ahead of his time in the machinery of being able to lift the loads up from the ground to the dome level by creating a clutch. I mean, he was the first one to create a clutch, and so that they didn't have to change the oxen to go around, or they didn't have to turn the oxen around to say, okay, I'm going to lower this load now. They just had to engage a clutch, and
Yeah.
and so the fact that he created a machine to me was even beyond the capability of raising the dome. It was creating a machine to raise and lower loads that was 200 years ahead of its time. So we spent a lot of time talking about that.
Exactly. And one thing about the book itself is its detail is overly impressive, to the point that it's both a storyline of historical and non-fiction, and at times it borderlines into fiction because it takes all of the known accounts and it says here, hey, here's what these three different accounts say. They're all kind of different, but on the technical aspect of describing exactly why it was so difficult to even scale that space, and that the true classical the true classical technologies have truly been lost in the Dark Ages, and he had to almost instinctively just understand how he could get a grounded, and also the extreme patience, because the porter had to dry for so long, that they couldn't exactly slap it together. So I feel also with that patience of understanding how it will put all pork. So one question is, so the crucial aspect are those stone and wood chains, and pedal at times also, that's actually holding the dome in and keeping that push force in. So was that absolutely revolutionary or something more pre-discovered? Because it seems, I don't know, that the poor classical buildings were basically stacked instead of anything too um
So if you compare it to the Pantheon,
uh-huh.
the that was, I don't know how many pours that they did for that, but that was the largest spanning dome in the world at that time. In the Hagia Sophia, another giant spanning dome. Neither one of them were a double dome, which Brunelleschi proposed. And so I found, there were a number of things that were of interest to me. So, and I don't remember the name of the designer or architect, but they the council, the opera, the group that was in charge of the dome, they laid, January 1st of every year, they laid their hands on the model that was built of the double dome, and they said a prayer saying, we are going to honor this, honor the construction, honor the design of this. And, Brunelleschi was the only one to really come up with an idea to be able to do that without, building the scaffolding from the ground. And the issue really was technology. From a technological point of view, they couldn't build. I mean, they didn't have enough lumber in all of Italy to be able to build the scaffolding to do it the way that you would normally build an arch. So they had to find a way to do that. And, Brunelleschi was the one to come to them and say, this is the way I wanted to do it. So one of the things that we discussed in class was the idea that they had so many fucking competitions. They had a competition to,
Exactly.
do the doors. They had a competition to do the dome. They had a competition even for the the stone cages that went around the dome as it was being erected. So when they reached a certain height before it, before the stone started to be at an angle where it would fall in, they had to build the stone cages. They had a competition for it, and Ghiberti was there at every step of the way,
Exactly.
and Brunelleschi prevailed. I mean, he said, this is the way you should do it. I've got an idea, and they ended up selecting his approach to each one of those. But so one of the questions I asked to my students is that as you prove yourself as an architect to do, a certain task, how many times are you going to have to prove yourself to a client? And, if you have to prove yourself at almost every turn, at some point do you say, fuck this, I'm going to walk away from it because you guys are just exercising me too much? So we had a lot of conversation about that.
Part of it kind of seems to depend on what the commission is, because in growing up in the shadow of the domeless Duomo, he just always envisioned it. And I think similar to Caudy and Sagrada Pompilia, that he would literally die trying to accomplish it. And it's so funny. I mean, every step, especially the crane, and even like the final temple or the steeple that's on the lantern that's on top, that was still a competition. And
It was, and I'm sure, I'd be sitting there as Brunelleschi and say, what the fuck do I have to do to get you guys to trust me?
yeah, it seemed that was the one point, at least the book expressed, that Brunelleschi was a little perturbed. But throughout all of these competitions, he had to do everything in secret out in the hills, and was so paranoid of being caught or plagiarized, that it was really interesting that up until pretty much recently, his crane was given credit for invention to Da Vinci. And because he burned all of his drawings, and there was no real proof until later records came out.
Even the lantern where, the carpenter that he trusted so much in his previous competitions to build the models stole his idea for the lantern. And and so yeah, he was absolutely paranoid about all of that. So we did talk a lot about the first ever patent that he ever
Oh
had
yeah.
was his barge that was supposed to take the stone down from Pisa to Florence, failed dramatically, and so we don't really have any drawings of that. But they issued the first patent ever in all of history, and yet it was an ultimate failure for him. So again, we talked a lot about the fact that failure is a wonderful device for teaching you how to succeed. And so not everything that Brunelleschi touched was gold. You know, I would say 95% of what he touched was gold, but there was 5% out there that he just fucked up and he had wrong. And that, that's okay because, um, failure teaches you a lot of things. He spent 4 years trying to get the stone out of the bottom of the Arno, raised up and trucked down to Florence so that they could build the ribs of the 8 different sides or the eight different spines for the dome. But it never succeeded. He never was able to raise the stone that they dropped to the bottom of the Arno, or and but yet all of the other inventions that he had, whether it was the crane or whether it was the lift that had a clutch to it. I mean, those are the things that really pushed him to the edge of prominence. And in fact, even when they even on his when he died and they interred him, the remnants of him was not the inventors of the dome, but the fact that he was the inventors of all these machines. The fact, and so in Latin it was about the fact that he created these machines to to do these inventive things, but they never really credited him, Brunelleschi, for this is the guy that created the dome.
Really?
Yeah, it was all about the machines that he invented more than it was him building the dome itself. And it wasn't a slight necessarily. It was, it was, a great accolade for him. But he's one of two. Um, so he's the only other non-saint to be interred um, at Santa Maria della Fiore, right?
Oh yeah. So you think architects of today are spending enough time on the actual process of building, or is like it doesn't seem that we're too focused on improving that aspect, which that seems like pretty crucial to um uh construction.
Well, I don't know if I'm going to answer that question, but I'll answer it in a different way.
Uh-huh.
That I found it interesting that these were some of the first competitions that were offered to architects and designers, and from that point forward, before the dome and Brunelleschi, there really weren't competitions to build this church or build that piece or build this element. But since then, it set a precedent for competitions to build this or that, even in today's times. And I find it incredibly interesting that that approach, from the owner side or the to solicit, um, uh, you know, models and drawings and so on, um, has prevailed really since the mid 14th century, and it still exists today in actually a very real way. I mean, you know, for the for the really the highest and best competitions that are out there internationally, you're submitting drawings, you're submitting models, you're trying to tell a story, but it really started with Brunelleschi, and and that really set the pace for how patrons really looked at architects, and um, and as we know from at least Ross King's point of view, that Brunelleschi put architects on the map. Before that time, everything was part of, if you were doing it, if you were building a church, you were doing it for the greater glory of God. It wasn't for the greater glory of yourself. And not necessarily that Brunelleschi was trying to hoard all of that for himself, but um, he was able to define a role for architects moving forward to this day. And he really set, architects, the role of the architect into a profound and significantly important role for building monuments, you know moving forward for the next what 700 years, 1200 years, whatever it is.
So in that, it seems that, especially following him through the Renaissance, there were a lot of different people that ascended to those roles, as well as the point man of a construction project. Or and in that, to uh, I we're in such a collaborative age, to find it almost impossible to almost preclaim or redo the control that Brunelleschi had, because even within a firm, there's a lot of discussion, and that can easily lead into second-handers, and what's the consensus or the overall group versus it being really an individual in charge. Like, is that dynamic crucial of having like one person end all be all? Because also today we have massive construction projects, massive, you know.
So
Oh,
I would say that, and we can talk about this with the next book, but probably Frank Lloyd Wright was the last true master builder, that had a sense of, both construction and engineering, and how he developed projects, and how he propelled them forward. I guess you could stretch it a little bit and say Mies had a bit of that. Um, I'm not quite sure that Korb did, but certainly Frank Lloyd Wright, um, you know, really fulfilled that role of master builder. And so for the 500 years between Brunelleschi um, and Frank Lloyd Wright, the architect as master builder, both engineer and architect, played out. Most of the architects of the late Renaissance, all the way through the Enlightenment and through even early modernism, had a strong degree of influence on the engineering aspect of what they did. But today,
exactly.
that's not at all. I mean, it is a collaboration between structural engineer, master planner, architect, and even the end client.
And what do you think that is due to, that split?
I think it's the complication of the construction of the construction industry. Of
Yeah.
There's too much to know. I mean, I think that we all are trained as architects to understand structural issues, but in order to get it built in an economical way, you release that control to your structural engineer. I mean, if I were, and I've done this. I mean, on smaller projects, I've offered my structural evaluation of projects, and I've had clients and friends go out and build things based on my recommendations, but it's probably not the most economical. um,
Mm.
they probably, it's probably overly engineered in a
Mm.
sense. I mean, I've run the calculations myself, and you have projects that are, again, probably a little bit over engineered, in the sense that if you spend, let's just say 25% of the cost of the project is in the the cost of the concrete, or the structural steel, or whatever. um, if I were to make a suggestion to somebody, it might be 35 or 40% of the cost of a building. If I were to engineer it myself, it wouldn't be 22.5% of the cost of the project. And the engineers are able to do that, um, to a much more finite degree than I can do, myself. So I know the principles, and can make recommendations, but I really rely on the structural engineer to make it the most economical
Yeah.
from a cost point of view.
And that point is really something I grasped my last semester of undergrad in my structures 2 course, where the final project was essentially running the numbers of this same 3 or so story building, and should we build it out of wood, concrete, or steel? What's the cheapest? And just I feel a part of that preciseness is the rigor, because I feel when an architect kind of does structure, like how many times is it 2 or 3 or 4 passes? You know, I feel it's almost more intuitive and and a tad more artistic. But I feel if you can marry that engineering more and then almost use the engineering in your favor instead of showing some engineer a crazy thing and just crossing your fingers, you know. Like obviously it's
Yeah,
that
but look at,
middle ground.
I mentioned Casa Musica, Rem Koolhaas project.
Hmm.
His collaboration with the engineer is this is the design that I want to have. I don't care if a beam, and he literally doesn't. I don't care if a beam runs through the middle of a lobby, because I'm kind of excited about that. I'm kind of excited about the fact that the structure is revealed in a certain way, and
Hmm.
and so you have that part of it, but at the same time, if you think about one of the things that's happening in California, which is really interesting, is there's a big movement for doing mass timber projects,
Hmm.
because it's a very sustainable building effort, and it's a very kind of ecologically responsible way to approach projects. So when you look at the mass timber side of it, you have an architect that is saying we need to do this out of mass timber. I'm not quite sure all the right pieces to do. I'm going to hire a structural engineer to help me, but this is the direction that the project should go. So ultimately the architect is in control of that structural framework for which a building is built. And whether it's something that happens like Rem Koolhaas, something that happens almost serendipitously, where I've got a beam running through this main lobby space, or main uh, ascending stair. I'm okay with that, because it's showing that the structure really is a part of the design, or whether it's one of the projects that I love that has recently been done is the SOM project for Long Beach Library. It's all out of mass timber, and they drove the idea that we're going to do this out of mass timber. They weren't necessarily the engineers of it, but they the fact that as the architects they were saying we're going to do it this way, it 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 created an environment for the design of that project that is just absolutely beautiful.
Yeah, it is stunning. I'm looking at some pictures of it now. Just that's when you can really get into the expression of structure. And I would just argue in the more average kind of buildings, these architects aren't really trying to uh, design with the structure or the expression of it in mind. It's almost the opposite of let's try and hide it all and then put something fake on the outside, which is one way of doing it. But as one who really enjoys that expression of structure and how it's being built, and that's really the building ends. When that um one that comes to mind for me is basically anything by Prinzo Piano. You know, that's just absolute structure taken to the extreme at times. And I feel, I mean, I don't know the intricacies of his working of who he works with, but it seems he's super attentive to that structure down to every last detail instead of it being pushed off to some structural engine because also his buildings are so precise that any slight change to the structure kind of changes the whole thing. So I'm curious if it's a continuous discussion with his engineers or if they're in-house or how he's able to really truly express it in some insanely beautiful ways.
Well, I mean, if you look at the work of Ando or you look at the work of Louis Kahn,
Yeah.
uh, let's take a moment to talk about Louis Kahn. That was he was building buildings in the era before gypboard, so you couldn't put a gypboard ceiling in there because it didn't really exist in at that time. And so the ceilings that he designed for either the Yale Library or the Kimball Art Museum, you know, everything was integrated within the structure. The mechanical system, the electrical system, the structural system was all integrated. And you look at the beauty of those projects, and you just stand in awe of them because they didn't necessarily they weren't necessarily driving the structural impact of it, but they understood it enough to say, this is what I need to do, this is how it needs to perform, this is how it needs to look ultimately. And I think Renzo Piano is certainly one of those architects
Hmm.
today that is still doing that. In the same way that Brunelleschi understood structure and how it needs to perform, Renzo Piano understands that in the same way, and is, allowing his buildings to both reveal structure and hide it at the same time.
Mm, mm, exactly. Because especially piano, he's great at developing those follies. And so whenever Mackenzie and I were in Chicago visiting Paddleton, we spent about half a day at I'm blanking on the name of the museum.
The,
Is it,
the Art Institute.
yeah, yeah, yeah. And we went into the piano edition, and I didn't even know he actually built that. But as we were there, I was like, I'm not sure who this is, but I know it's piano because it is so elegant. It is so elegant and quite both old and rustic and clean. It has a point in one of his rooftop gardens. It's left to look as if it's still under construction, and how he really leaves things and reveals and at times hides things. But I feel his building. I mean, it's tough to call it efficient because that can mean so many different things. But I just don't see a lot of wasted moves, and when they are, it's artistic or in an expression
Well,
of
it's
something.
the simplicity of his work.
Yeah.
So if you look at Asher, if you were to do a partie of the Dasher, it's five simple walls with the structure in between that has all of the Venetian um, lights that or skylights that are about the size of my hand that are sitting over it, and there are thousands of those, right? An incredibly simple structure. If you look at the addition that he did to the um, the Kimball Art Museum, you know, it's an incredibly elegant and beautiful thing. Sorry, I'm hiccuping.
Not
But
hilarious.
yeah, but he replicated the the same structural um, system that Kahn had for the Kimball Art Museum. He did it across the um, he did it across the plaza garden area. But he replicated the simplicity of that, not in arches, but in flat way, in a flat structural system.
Whenever Renzo Piano did the addition to the Kimball, that it was pretty an homage to the original, and also pre-birthed in a very Renzo Piano-esque way, especially through an absolute different but similar expression of structure.
Yeah, I mean, I think that what he did at the Kimball was, truly following his passion of, revealing structure, but the same modulation of the, if you look at the bays that exist for the barrel vaulted forms that Kahn had, he replicated that, but in an entirely different way. And so, you know, you want to say that, that was ingenious all unto itself. That, the expression of the structure was still there. The modulation of the bay size he maintained, and it was, across the green space or plaza or zone, between the Kimball and his addition. There's only about, it's less than a football field. It's probably about,
Yeah, I suppose.
75 yards or so. But yet he maintained that same kind of modulation of structure horizontally in what he did, and still created, spaces like in auditorium and other kinds of exhibit spaces in there. So yeah, I mean, I think that, Piano is one of the architects that thrives on revealing, the structural elements of his projects in the same way that Kahn did, and the same way that, going back to Brunelleschi, in the same way that Brunelleschi did in his work.
Exactly, and especially with the Kimball, he's able to pay a lot of that homage, but at the same time, it's very different spatially. It's kind of like tripart in the first building, and on one side it's kind of a big open space with the columns, how you can put in floating walls, but on the other is almost this lower space, because he was not super dependent on the roof for hiding. There's this intimate, almost like cave like room. I saw the Monet exhibit there last summer, and they had all of the pillows in this very dark. I mean, the ceiling height was only maybe 10 feet or 8, maybe, versus it being pretty much vaulted, and in that it was just a different feel of the space, where I guess one kind of critique of the Kimball is each barrel is about the same space, but that's also the point. So like, you can also, as any good architect or architecture critic knows, you can critique anything to death. So
Well, I mean, so he created something that was, clearly respectful of Kahn and what he did there. But if you look at what he did at the High Museum for Richard Meyer, it's a very different kind of space. It's a very different kind of addition. But to me, Richard Meyer created this, object, which is absolutely beautiful in and of itself. But what Meyer did was create an environment and held space not only on the outside of the building, but the inside of the building, to really propel the notion of, viewing, objects of art, within this space. So,
mhm.
you know, I think pianos, uh, when they selected him for not only the High Museum, but also for the Kimball, he was absolutely the best person to choose for that, because in both arenas, he respected the original architecture that was there, but also added to it in a way that was, truly sublime.
Exactly, and something that really did it justice, and it makes it even more of a location and a place, and especially in Fort Worth itself, it's really in the heart of that arts district with quite a few things very walkable, and especially on those modern, and it's absolute.
And don't forget Philip Johnson's Amon Carter Museum right there as
Yeah,
well.
is I mean, that area is very prime and rich for all kinds of study and critique, honestly, because so many things are acting correct, but there's also ways it can for sure be heavily improved. Because they are a little bit isolated, but it's very tough to build in America, especially with all of the code for parking spaces, to build something without a parking lot. It seems that is very typical. Or, I mean, the easiest thing to do is just build a parking lot, because that's what's required instead of doing something underground, which is obviously expensive, or a pub, which is still not as cheap as a piece of land. But one could argue, at least for those two buildings in the Kimball and the Addition, they are objects, but I feel that piano really was able to turn it into a space, and in that a place, and the garden in between it is quite a a space in that you don't feel adjacent to any large parking lot. It's quite intimate, and uh yeah.
Yeah, so when I took, you and Madeline McKenzie out to the Kimball for the first time, Piano's Addition wasn't built yet, and there was just an open green space, to the west of the Kimball. And the fact that Piano didn't necessarily, he built an addition, but it wasn't adding on to the actual building itself, but it, really an environment of museums that truly makes it special.
Hmm.
Um, so he was truly the absolute right person to bring on for building in a quote unquote addition onto the Kimball, although it wasn't truly an addition.
Yeah.
It was an ancillary building that had a relationship with the existing, and that's the only way you can treat Khan. You can't. I don't think you can. I don't think you can ever add on to a Khan building. And I almost say, and we can talk about this in the next time when we talk about the Guggenheim. Gwathmey's addition onto the Guggenheim was absolutely beautiful. I think that they did an incredible job at preserving the beauty of Wright's original museum, yet adding on to the space that was needed for the Guggenheim in a way that, I mean, ultimately they just built a box. If you
Yeah.
look at it a very crude way, but it became a backdrop. It was like a billboard on the back of the sinuous forms that Wright had created, and they essentially created a backdrop.
Yeah,
Um,
and it's also quite evident that sometimes the right thing to do is respect the original wishes of the original designer, because a lot of times there's other iterations that don't quite have what was built, and especially before computers, when it seems to be buried in hard drives instead of on, like parchment. Uh, these buildings, or it was quite interesting seeing the Frank Lloyd Wright exhibits at the MoMA in it was, I think, 2 years ago, that they had all of these drawings that weren't actually of the ones that was actually built, and a few showed that simple square, but I think they just saw that also and tried to pay as much respect, instead of, oh yeah, here's another spiraling atrium space. I mean, it just put a had to have been pulled off in such almost an archigram type way that was over the top, to really works, and so they went, which is often the more difficult way, which is that simplicity. Because honestly, they probably could have built anything, Um,
They could have. And so one of my more recent projects was building an addition onto an existing hospital. And so I walk them through the principles of doing an addition. And there, in my opinion, there are three, primary elements when you do it in addition. You either need to match the forms, match the materiality, or match the color. And in some cases, all three of them work, and in some cases, maybe two or three, and maybe even only one. But in order to create an addition, so the examples that I used I used Venturi's example of what he did for the National Gallery in London,
mhm,
where I mean, we could probably spend 3 or 4 of these sessions talking about that, because that's just an incredible project. But the fact that he used both color, materiality, and form to match the in some ways the additional, or match the original in National Gallery, but yet he did it in a very incredibly playful way. So that was one of the examples I used. Another example that I used was, of course, the one we talked about already, um, um, uh, which is the Guggenheim. The fact that um, what Gwathmey Siegel did was to create a backdrop, so that the original architecture of the building could maintain. But the fact that they used color and materiality that was similar to the original forms that were there, tied it very nicely together and didn't compete with it. It
mhm.
it said, this was the original building, this is the new building, um, and it tied it together very nicely. And so in creating a presentation and creating um, um, an idea about how you add on to an existing series of structures, you have to educate your client and say, these are the three primary ways. You either do it through color, you do it through form, or you do it through materiality, or you do it through all three. And if you can do it through all three, you're very successful in doing that. And here are, you know, 7 different projects. So I used, Richard, I used the Renzo Piano project, which
Mm,
didn't necessarily match the form, but it matched the materiality and matched the color to the original architecture. I used, Venturi, I used the Gwathmey Siegel project for the Guggenheim. And so that now when I'm explaining it to a client, they can understand the fact that these world renowned projects that were added on to, you know, how do you go about doing that, and how do you apply that to their project? And it was a very easy conversation to have once I related some of those elements to them.
Exactly. And if I mean, there's a reason social proof works, and there's a reason there's more of that draw to kind of what's popular, and that's that struggle between Keating and Roark. And so we can have a more like in conclusion, and prop it up. It seems that Brunelleschi was all in one, and that sort of trajectory and path of designer and engineer really propelled, and it'll show evidence in next episode also, put the devil in the White City and Burnham and Brute, and how Brute is really the construction and structural genius, and Burnham is that artistic eye, and seeing that balance. And um this is one of the, if not the first project of this magnitude. I mean, it's at the World's Fair, and I have a few general thoughts and critiques of what they decided to design, but also I kind of understand it. But that's for next time. It really seems that Brunelleschi had to do everything because first off, he couldn't trust anyone because they would just steal it and claim credit and then receive the reward, because these series of competitions were also how he earned extra money, because it was 20 florins, 100 florins, whatever.
I mean, even the lantern where his carpenter was trying to take away from him, he ended up winning, even that competition. But the fact that he had to compete for every single thing, whether it was the the stone framing for the design of the dome itself, whether it was the lantern, it seemed like at every turn he had to compete for something. And the students and I talked a lot about competitions, and the fact that this was really the precedent for international competitions for this project and that project. um, it really all started with Brunelleschi, in the notoriety of the fact that the architect came into fruition as a true profession,
Mhm.
came about through Brunelleschi. So, again, these were the kinds of conversations that we had with the students, and it was, all a pretty interesting, dialogue that we had with regard to, future competitions, current competitions, how, um, you know, this company or that company would set a international competition in some, firm or group, or I mean, even if you look at Snøhetta as an example, they entered an international competition for the Alexandria Museum. And I
Mhm.
remember hearing, so one of the guys is actually all three of the originating partners for Snøhetta came from the University of Texas.
Mhm.
And one of them is a Texas boy, and the other two were from international upbringings. But the fact that they entered this competition, they ended up winning it, and they called themselves Snøhetta because it was a mountain near where one of the partners was born. And so they show up at in Alexandria to receive the award and to start the actual design of the building. and they're received at the airport, and they say, well, we're here to pick up Snowhetta, who is here. It was just the three guys that started the firm, and they're like, oh yeah, we've got like 15 people down, back at our office, and Norway, and we're fine, and they didn't know what the fuck they were doing, but the idea that they had created something that was truly unique for the Alexandria Museum, and they won an international competition. From that, they have propelled themselves to the international spotlight in the same way that Bjarke Ingels has. Uh,
Exactly.
uh, and so that is a way of truly distinguishing yourselves in architecture, is to win an international competition like that. So it was really interesting to hear the story of how they came about, the fact that they showed up to be picked up, and they asked them, well, how many people do you have in your office? And they were counting on their fingers. Well, we've got 15 people back at our office, but four of them are the UPS guys that show up to deliver this package. um, that was a way of them, you know, trying to legitimize what they've done. But it doesn't mean that the creativity is limited to a single individual, or that you can't carry out what you've created. And so you look at the competition that Brunelleschi did. Yes, he was an individual, and most of the competitions that are done today are accomplished by groups, or even small groups. That's fine, but that is a way to truly propel you into the international spotlight. And had Snowhetta not won the Alexandria Library competition, they would be three guys from University of Texas that are doing garage editions today.
Yeah. S- So do you think that's still kind of the only way to hit that sort of notoriety?
From an international point of view, absolutely. I mean, I think that if you want to put yourself on the international landscape, try winning an international competition will absolutely put you there. And so if you want to start to compete with people like Rem Koolhaas and Big, and others that are out there who are winning these works, winning an international competition that has some level of notoriety will put you on that landscape. So you've got to pull all the punches, go after a project like that, and win it. And once you do, then that starts to set you up for um, success on the international framework of projects.
Because those sorts of open competitions seem like really the only way to get your stuff in front of people's eyes, because a lot of these decision makers that are the clients, they're real busy doing other things, like having the building built often isn't their only priority. Like they have other businesses or ventures or what have you. And it seems through that open competition. I mean, like at my old firm, it was like, no, we are not doing any paper projects at all, no competitions whatsoever. And I mean, like on one hand, that's very understandable, especially in certain niches, but especially if you're trying to do larger projects that you haven't done before, like you aren't going to have an an invite to bid, on any project that you've never even done before. It seems still like the only way. I mean, like today is a little different because you can get some social proof through social media, but still, these decision makers aren't the ones really following you. It's for the
They're,
public.
they're not following you on social media. They're looking at the end result. And so I
Exactly.
really believe that if you want to be on the international landscape, to win an international competition is certainly a way to get there quickly. Otherwise, if you go out and start your own firm, you're going to be doing garage additions for the next 20 years of your life until you make that leap.
Yeah, because it's seems it's just so expensive to build, and everyone wants to make sure you can do it, especially at cost and properly, so they don't have to tear it down or sue you later or get sued. Um, that's that's sort of barrier. Like you have to step up or take that leap. And it seems like through all the studying I've done of past major projects, a lot of them are, these open competitions, and they'll sift through all of them because they don't really want to turn anything down. I mean,
Yeah, I mean, there are competitions that are out there for people who have done these kinds of projects before, but there are, as you said, open competitions for people who really have inventive and creative ideas. And that's the kind of competition that Snowhetta did to win the Alexandria Library. I had a buddy of mine 20 some odd years ago that entered a competition. Again, it was a library, not that libraries are the competition you should enter, but he and a couple of friends of his from Princeton entered the competition. They ended up winning it, and they wanted to, even though they were hired on by a much larger firm, they were allowed to complete that competition and allowed to complete the design work associated with that. But I don't think that they would have been hired on to the much larger firm without the fact that they won that pivotal competition.
exactly.
And so I think that, being aware of those things that are out there from an international basis, and if you listen, if you want to have a firm of your own, winning an international competition is not necessarily the mother lode. I mean, but it is a means to an end to certainly establish your practice and really start from there. Otherwise, you are doing, you're going to spend 20 years doing garage additions, for friends and family and other things, without that. So that is a vehicle for you to really put your new firm, on a national or international landscape.
It, and it seems also that it's super advantageous to take those risks earlier on. I mean, obviously, economic viability is crucial, but I mean, we're in the day and age of people having multiple jobs, and you could for sure figure it out if you were actually invested. And so it seems like the adage of casting out as wide of a net as possible and just never really throwing what's out there, and early on, and especially early on, to try and gain that notoriety, because once you're already in that discussion of bigger Snowhetta or Morphosis or whomever, and I d- don't even know if that real architecture is an ideal goal, but they're also just people too. It's not like there's some other insanely different human that only thinks things. I mean, it seems like there's a playing field out there as long as you don't limit all of the shots that you can potentially take.
I mean, Steve Jobs is known for his comment that, everybody in the room is not necessarily smarter than you are. um, and so it's really projecting yourself in a role that you can take advantage of a situation or a competition or an event. It doesn't mean that you're smarter than anybody else that competed for it, but the fact that you've competed for it and you've won puts you in the driver's seat to succeed in other areas. So if you truly want a practice of your own, that is an area, I mean, demonstrated by, Ghiberti and Brunelleschi, that is an area, if a competition is out there, go for it. And if you have the right answer and you end up winning it, there are a whole host of firms and alliances that we can look back on that have great success stories based on one kind of almost freak accident of them winning a competition, right?
Exactly. And then that comes back to that crucial question where you're really trying to investigate is when you have that blank page and it's for something, especially a competition that's being judged by others, like do you go the full Keating parity route of finding everything out you can about the person who's judging you and then picking what they like, or do you try and really study the case objectively and figure out what the best possible solution, because a building is nothing more than solving a bunch of problems. I mean, shelter for one, but there's a bunch of program and economics and I mean, it all goes into any different type of building, just a certain different dynamics.
Yeah, for me, it's not following what the crowd wants, but really following your heart, following your passion, following the things that you find truly inventive and original, and that's the thing that juries gravitate toward. I mean, I've sat on a lot of um, of juries for design awards and other kinds of things, and the the thing that appeals to me is the originality that comes out through the work, and where you're trying to do something unique. And so it's not following the crowd. It's not necessarily that Richard Keating is all bad, but it's not following the Richard Keating route. It's really following the Howard Roark route, and it's not trying to be, I'm all alone. I'm doing it by myself. I'm going to be Brunelleschi, but it is following your individual passions and creating something that's truly unique.
And also in very practical terms, it seems like knowing really where to stand your ground when things have to be cut because prices fluctuate, or who really knows what, and in that very difficulty of it being built, can you really be Brunelleschi? I am just really enjoying these really investigations through conversation into both the practical versus the ideal and how to try and marry the two, and not be too strung up on one or the other.
Yeah, I mean that's absolutely how I try to address my students. They ask really interesting questions. I mean, one of the questions that, and we can talk about this the next time, but one of the questions that they asked this last time was, um, should I be pursuing a career in architecture or something else? Because, what's the payout here? And, and I told them what I've consistently told you is that if you decide for in a career in architecture, it has to be something that comes from your heart, because you're going to work really hard for a long time and earn shit wages and work really long hours, and eventually it'll pay off. Because, and I said that, some of the senior principals at some of the larger firms, they'll make 7-figure bonuses. I mean, bonuses, um, which is holy fuck. But, um, it takes you a while to get to that point. So, are you willing to, if this is really something that is you're passionate about, if this is something that your heart is set on, then yes, absolutely pursue it. But if it's something that you're ambivalent on, a career in business, a career, moving to a developer, and I shared with them probably what I shared with you, which is the idea that there were a number of students that went through undergraduate with me that by the time they got to their 4th year, they had already reconciled the fact that they weren't going to be the star designer in XYZ firm. And so they decided they were going to move into real estate or move into other related practices, that, they were interested in architecture, but it wasn't something that they were overly passionate about. They wanted to stay in touch with it, but it wasn't a career for them. And that's
Yeah.
okay. And there's no value statement about that. There's nothing to say that what they've chosen to do is wrong or poor or less than what I've chosen to do or somebody else has chosen to do. It has to be something that they're choosing to do. But if you choose to continue on with architecture, it's going to be a hard row. I mean, it's going to be a difficult profession. And eventually it'll pay off. Eventually you're going to get to a point where, you're paid pretty well, and people are going to respect what you've done over your career. But it's going to take a while to get there. And if that's okay with you, then fine, stick with it. And if that's not something that interests you, then you probably need to move on to something else. So even at the end of the Brunelleschi discussion, that was one of the comments that came up.
Exactly. And um we got that talk from our professor, 3rd year Professor Nason. He put on this whole long monologue about how you don't have to just explicitly be an architect to be in architecture, because it's such a vast realm and everyone interacts. And again, it comes back to that self-awareness of who am I and where am I going to really find my true passion and on the way to finding a true purpose, which is just our passion helping others, and it's truly something that seems that is at the heart of this passage and investigation, that it really has to come back to who am I? And if you don't understand that first, then how can you ever help anybody else
You
at
can't.
all?
You really have to understand who you are, where you want to go, what your goal is. And, so we're 5 weeks into this, and we've had a lot of discussions in our class about, you know, even what Richard Keating. So you take, Keating, and you say, well, is he wrong? Is he bad? Is he good, or is he bad? And you can't really say that the position that he takes in architecture is necessarily bad. It's what he felt like was right for him, and that's fine. And the fact that, the people that I had in graduate school, I had some, incredibly brilliant designers in graduate school that wanted to go back to Iowa, just do, they wanted to build homes for people in their community. So can you say that that's wrong? No, you absolutely cannot say that that's wrong. Yeah, or assess a value judgment to that. It's they were following their passions, and you know could they at the same time, could they have been lead designers at SOM? Yeah, absolutely. They had the talent for doing that, but that's not where their passions lied. So you in the same way that Howard Roark found his passion and followed it, you have to do that. And in kind of a strange way, Keating found his passion and followed that. You can't necessarily fault them for that or say that one is evil and one is good. You have to really determine where you are in your own career, in your own following, in your own passion, and truly follow that. And there's nothing wrong with following your passion. If you ended up on the developer side, or you end up in an accounting firm, or you end up as the lead designer for an architectural firm, then that's great because you followed your own individual passions for that.
It, it does seem, though, that at least in the explicit story of the Fountainhead, that she's really arguing that like, maybe Keating isn't wrong as in like Maleficent, but she definitely argues that Tui is, and it's kind of heavily hinted that Winans is as well because he's only chasing after that power. But I mean, how can also you tell people to not play their role of who they are in society? It's that balance between who I am and how can I improve, but how can I improve if who I am is the one that has to do the improving? If I am the one that is completely having every shortcoming,
Well, so yes, I agree that if you're not being honest with yourself, so that's the thing that Ayn Rand really pulls out, is that if you're not being honest with yourself about who you are, you're failing in that pursuit. And so Keating was just trying to um, placate the masses. He was trying to be the favorite son for everybody to like him, but he wasn't being honest with himself inside. And that's necessary. That's the difference. Where Rourke was truly being honest with himself. And yes, he had some a lot of struggles to get there, but he was truly being honest with who he was and what he wanted to do. And that's what I was trying to get across with my students, is that if you're Philip Johnson, and again, we can talk about this because the next book is like really interesting. If you're Philip Johnson and you do placate to the masses, and your architectural style just depends on what decade it is, that's what he did. But at the same time, he empowered an entire generation of architects that changed our world in a way that is so significant. So he wasn't necessarily trying to be the architect of the ages. He was really putting himself in the position of being a mentor and an advocate for people who could actually change architecture, and really move it into the next millennium, or the next era of what we needed to discover. And so, and I'll just tell you straight up, I fucking hate Johnson's architecture. I think he's a plagiarist. I think his work is schlock. It's shtick. It's crap. But the influence that he exercised over architecture was incredibly profound, and so you cannot ever negate that. Even from the earlier stages of his uh, um, his conflict with Frank Lloyd Wright. all the way up through the time of his own death. So the issue is what I'm really trying to say, and what Anranda was trying to say, is just being true and honest to yourself. And that's the failure of Keating, was that he was trying to placate the masses instead of just really being honest about who he was. I mean, for all intents and purposes, Keating was Philip Johnson. I mean, let's be honest about that, right? But what Keating didn't do was influence a whole generation of younger architects to do something beyond himself. What Keating did, I mean, what Roark did by his own work, was to say, this is where we need to go, and I'm going to show you the way, and you can either follow me or move out of the way. And so he created his own path to define where architecture should go by his own internal compass. And so he was honest with himself about it. And so I think that's the distinction between the two, is that, and again, it's an interesting thing, because Phil, again, when you talk about Philip Johnson, and we can talk about this in our next discussions, but Johnson was never truly, I don't think, honest with himself about architecture in the pure pretense of what it was. It was a means to an end for him, versus Mies or Korb or others, that they had a very clear idea of how they wanted architecture to evolve. And that was very Roarkian about them, versus Johnson's, who was very Keating, right? So again, I asked the question: what's the value proposition here? Are you saying that everything that Keating stood for is bad? Well, yes and no. I mean, yes, in the sense that he didn't follow his heart, but no, in the sense that Johnson did the same thing, but yet he empowered other people who were more talented and more capable than he was, who he recognized, to propel them into the architectural pantheon. And they did amazing, wonderful work, which we all admire today.
And I think that word empowerment and truly giving these people a platform instead of controlling them and saying, "Oh, I did this." I mean, he kind of like obviously latched onto Mies a lot, but it's not as if everyone didn't know who was actually the one behind, for instance, the Seagrams. It's just obvious. But I think the issue with Keating and being more of that nature is the issue of feedback. Is whenever you do something that gets a positive response, you keep trying to tap that vein, and that's what you're chasing. And then whenever the landscape inevitably shifts, like for instance in architecture, it shifted from modern to post. Well, Philip Johnson just kind of scooted along and then begin to really push the post-modern, which in his invisible hand influence, yeah, great, but also we have quite a few buildings that wouldn't have ever been erected without his stature as having that influence. Because would anyone have truly have accepted, like for instance, the AT&T building in New York, like if it wasn't Philip Johnson, or any of the buildings in Dallas and Houston? you know, like it's the
No,
prestige of.
they absolutely would not have. But at the same time, so he went from modernism to postmodernism to deconstructivism, and but yet his ability to influence the careers of Charles Gwathmey and Richard Meyer and Michael Graves and Rem Koolhaas, I mean, these are people that without them, our architecture would be much less than what it is today. I mean, you can love or hate Richard Meyer, you can love or hate Michael Graves, but the fact that the work that they produced was something to understand, in some cases emulate, in other cases respect, but even move beyond. That was the work that was so influential for 30 years in architecture, and you can't negate that. You can't set that aside. You can't say, oh well, that was just an era of postmodernism or an era of figurative architecture.
One
mean,
has to one has to question though, like say you remove Philip Johnson, which in the story of architecture you can't because he spans from Frank Lloyd Wright to Frank Gehry. It's like he's there, But I'm curious in more of a thought experiment, what would have risen more to the top because he did kind of play uh, uh, that two-y role of that hand of saying what's appropriate and what's not. I mean, from flat out leaving Frank Lloyd Wright out of the international style, I mean, it was very obvious of this was his curation. And I think he coined the term, maybe someone else, but it was for sure that was the start of him being the in crowd, and then everyone aspiring to that, and it just I'm curious how much he changed with the times or actually guided that change.
I think it's a little bit of both, and that is a great segue to our next segment.
It is spot on. I have really enjoyed these uh long conversations, and I'm pretty getting a thought out of it myself. I'm finding whenever I'm speaking, I'm still focusing almost too much on what I'm saying versus this is more of an exercise for me of how I am saying it. So I feel as
You're doing great. You're
yeah,
doing great.
thank you. And w- we should hopefully talk this weekend. I don't know if I'll be done with the book by Friday, but
Fine.
hopefully pretty
We'll talk.
um
I did tell you that I spent like a whole host of time trying to stutter over the word exhibition versus, yeah, I did tell you that.
yeah, you did. Yeah.
And I get it out. I mean, I was speaking with a mask on, and you're like,
So
yeah, and I couldn't get exposition versus exhibition, and I was stuttering over that, and I'm like, oh my god, I know exactly how Montgomery feels.
yeah, exactly. It's
Exhibit and so I just like gave it up, and I
yeah,
another word like competition or something.
exactly. Often times I have other words lined up in my brain. I often think like how much smarter I could be if a portion of my brain wasn't so focused on trying to tiptoe around the dictionary. You know what I mean? Um, if I can actually focus more and come back to the content versus trying to think the sentence or two ahead and then saying, "Oh no, I'm gonna stutter on this or that word," and then try and maneuver or ground it or like flow into it or to just try and have different kinds of tricks. And a lot of it is still coming down to this practice and this continuous, really long form discussion.
I never really thought in those terms, but I'll tell you that there was a there was a one of my youth pastors when I want to say I was probably 14. One of my youth pastors, I felt like had an incredible vocabulary, and he and I had, we stayed. I was waiting for my parents to pick me up, and we stayed late, and we were talking about it. And I was asking him about the fact that I was really impressed at how many different words he had to say about, this issue or that issue. And, I think that to me, that became a defining moment for trying to create a vocabulary that had multiple outlets on how you explain something, whether
Mm.
it was to, the very, basic elements of a conversation to, something, significantly more sophisticated than that. And it always um, driven me to improve my vocabulary and to try to find, again, multiple outlets for, any word that I was saying or any expression that I was trying to make. It wasn't just a single word, but it was three or four different types of words that express the same thing.
Mm.
So that might be a way in which you can start to think about this, Montgomery.
Yeah. So, did he express why he had such a dense vocabulary, or was it just he was well read, or just one of those people who had a thing for words?
I think it was just one of those things that he had. He was a person that captured those words in his head and his mind and his life. And so even when he would say something, he would describe something, and he would use a word, and there was almost a pause to wait for people's recognition of that word. And if they didn't recognize it, would use another word and another pause, and people didn't necessarily recognize, and they would use another more commonly associated word, and people go like, oh, okay, I know what you're saying. And so, and I just remember this conversation that I had with him about how impressed I was with his command of the language, and that he had all of different words to express the same idea. And I think he just, if I remember correctly, he just said that it was something that he was he wasn't necessarily trying to impress anybody. He was just trying to explain himself in a way that was, understood by a variety of different audiences.
Yeah, and that's honestly a way that I had never thought about it before, and to continually to flip it into an educational exercise, and that's all what this is about. So again, thank you